My wife said she felt like she married too young. She wanted to experience life and figure out who she really was. After 4 years of marriage, I told her she was free to go. 8 months later, she came back saying she made a mistake. But by then my life had completely changed. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Brennan Hale was the kind of man who fixed things quietly and never asked for credit. He grew up in a house where the furnace broke every other winter and the pipes complained whenever the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. His father worked double shifts at a bottling plant, and his mother stretched every grocery run like she was solving a math problem. Money was tight enough that Brennan learned early how to use his hands, how to read an instruction manual, how to make something work when it had no business working at all. He was the oldest of 3 children and the one who absorbed the lessons of scarcity best, not by becoming afraid of the world, but by learning to be useful in it. He was the boy in the neighborhood who fixed his bicycle by taking it apart and understanding it before putting it back together. He was the teenager who helped the widow 2 doors down when her water heater failed and her son was 3 states away. He was the young man who did not celebrate the end of high school by going to parties, but by spending a week rebuilding a small outboard motor his uncle had given up on. By the time the engine ran again, he felt something he could not quite name. Competence, maybe. The satisfaction of a problem solved by effort and patience alone. By the time he turned 22, he had a certification from the vocational program at the community college and a job at Renner Transport, a mid-sized delivery company on the edge of Grand Rapids. He spent his days inside diesel engines, chasing down leaks and worn belts and fuel injector issues that other mechanics had given up on. The shop was loud and smelled like oil and rubber, and Brennan liked it. There was something honest about broken things. You found the problem. You fixed it. The truck ran again. Simple math. His neighbors trusted him the way people trust someone who has never given them a reason not to. People on the block would knock on his door on Saturday mornings with jumper cables and troubled expressions. Brennan never turned anyone away. He would roll out his portable kit, pop the hood, and get to work while the neighbors stood there apologizing for the interruption. He never needed the apology. Helping was just something he did, the same way breathing was something he did. Without announcement, he met Cassidy Bowen during the summer. He was 24. She was working at a diner on the eastern shore of Lake Monroe, one of those places with vinyl booths and a pie case near the register that turns slowly under a glass dome. He had gone there with his buddy Garrett after a long Saturday at the garage. The place was full when they walked in, loud with the lunch crowd and smelling of coffee and fried food. And the waitress who waved them toward the last open booth had dark red hair and a laugh loud enough to carry over all of it. That was Cassidy. She brought their coffee without being asked and made a joke about the pie of the day that Brennan did not even fully catch because he was watching the way she moved through the room, the way she talked to every table like she already knew the people sitting there. She had a quality that made her the center of things without appearing to try. And Brennan, who had never particularly wanted to be in the center of anything, found it unexpectedly arresting. When she came back to take their order, she looked directly at him when she wrote it down. Not at her notepad. At him. He left a 30% tip and came back the following Saturday. The second time, she remembered his order without asking. The third time, she brought him a slice of cherry pie he had not ordered and said it was a recommendation and that if he didn't like it, she would eat it herself. He liked it. She sat down across from him for 3 minutes on her break, while Garrett pretended to find something very interesting in the parking lot. And by the time she stood up to go back to work, Brennan had already decided he would come back as many times as it took. They dated for 8 months before he proposed. He did it at the diner, at the same booth, with a ring he had been paying off in installments for 3 months. It was not a large ring. He had considered going into more debt for a larger one, and then decided that would be ridiculous, that a ring was a symbol and not a financial statement, and that if she needed a larger stone to say yes, then he probably had the wrong person. She laughed when she saw the box. Then she started crying. Then she said yes without a moment's hesitation, and he felt something release in his chest that he had not known was held tight. They got married the following June when Brennan was 25. The ceremony was small. His parents were there, and a few people from the garage, and Cassidy's college friends who came up from Columbus in a rented van. The reception was at a rented hall that had a sticky floor and a DJ who played a lot of music from 15 years ago, and it was exactly right. Brennan danced twice, once with Cassidy and once with his mother, and he spent the rest of the evening with a beer in his hand watching his wife work the room. She was extraordinary at that, being in a space, filling it up, making everyone feel like she had come specifically to see them. They settled into the small house on Maplewood Drive 6 months after the wedding. Brennan had been saving for it since he was 19, a down payment fund. He contributed to every month the way other people of his age contributed to going out more or buying better cars. The house needed work, but that was fine. He patched the roof himself over 2 weekends. He retiled the bathroom floor on a long holiday weekend while Cassidy painted the bedroom walls a pale gray color she had picked from a swatch at the hardware store. They cooked together on Sunday evenings. They argued about nothing serious. The house smelled like coffee in the mornings and sometimes like would stain when Brennan was refinishing something in the garage, and in the evenings the neighborhood went quiet and familiar outside the windows. He liked who he was in those early years. He was not a complicated man, and he did not need a complicated life. He wanted to do work that mattered, come home to something worth coming home to, and move forward steadily. Cassidy's energy balanced him in a way he had not known he needed. She dragged him to things he would not have attended alone and introduced him to people he would not have sought out, and he found that the world was larger and more interesting when he moved through it next to someone who took up space the way she did. He did not tell her that very often because he was not naturally expressive in words, but he tried to show it in the ways available to him. In the coffee made, and the roof fixed, and the small trip they took to a cabin on Lake Michigan the second year. Just the two of them, where they played cards in the evenings, and he had not thought about work once in 3 days. For a while, the house felt like exactly what it was supposed to be. But somewhere in the third year, Cassidy started changing. It was subtle at first, the way most damage is. She started going out more on weeknights, saying she needed time with her friends, that she felt cooped up, that she was tired of the same routine. Brennan understood that. He was not a social man himself, but he understood the need. He told her to go. He meant it fully. He was not the type of husband who required his wife to be in the house on a Tuesday night, and he did not become suspicious without cause. But the nights out got longer. A dinner that ended at 10 turned into her coming home at 2 in the morning, shoes in hand to the front door so she would not wake him. A girl's weekend in the city started happening almost every month. Her phone, which she used to leave charging on the kitchen counter, moved to the bedroom and stayed face down. She changed the lock code without mentioning it. Brennan noticed, but said nothing. There were explanations for each of these things individually, and he had no interest in manufacturing suspicion from circumstantial evidence. He noticed other things too. The way she answered questions with questions. The way she had stopped asking about his day with any genuine interest. The way she looked at their living room, sometimes a quick, calculating survey, like she was noting exits. He tried to close the distance the way he fixed things at work. Methodically, with patience. He made reservations at a restaurant she had mentioned wanting to try. She was tired that night, and they stayed home instead. He suggested a weekend trip upstate, just the two of them, somewhere with a lake and no fixed schedule. She said maybe never materialized into anything. He did not push. Pushing was not in his character, and he had begun to understand quietly, somewhere below the level of direct thought, that the gap between them was not the kind that could be closed by dinner reservations. He tried in other ways, too. He came home early one Friday with flowers he bought from the grocery store on the way. Nothing elaborate, just the kind of thing you do when you want someone to know you were thinking about them on a Tuesday afternoon. She smiled and put them in a vase and said they were pretty, and that was the end of it. He tried talking to her on a Sunday morning. Actually talking, asking what she wanted from the next few years, what she was looking forward to, whether there was something missing that they could address together. She said she was fine. She said things were fine. She said it the way you say something to make a question stop. He was not a man who gave up on things. He was a man who fixed things. But you could not fix something that someone was actively choosing to leave, and no matter how steadily he held his tools, he could feel the shape of what was happening, the slow, deliberate withdrawal of someone who had already decided to go and was simply managing the exit. Then one Tuesday evening in late October, she came home from work and stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed over her chest, and the posture alone told him that what was coming had been prepared in advance. "I feel like I'm married too young," she said. Brennan was at the sink. He had just gotten home and was washing the engine grease from his hands, working the soap carefully into the creases across his knuckles. He kept washing. "What does that mean for us?" he asked. "I don't know who I am yet." Her voice was even, rehearsed. "These words have been practiced. I need to experience life. I need to figure out what I actually want before it's too late." The faucet ran. Steam curled up from the hot water. Brennan turned the words over the way he turned a problem over in his mind to the garage, checking each side, looking for the structural issue. He thought about the house on Maplewood, the roof he had fixed, the ring he had paid off in installments. He thought about Sunday dinners and early mornings and the specific laugh she used to have at the diner before he even knew her name. He thought about all the distance that had appeared so slowly between them that he had managed to pretend for a long time that it was not real. He turned off the faucet, dried his hands on the kitchen towel, folded it back over the oven handle. Then he looked at his wife. "If that's what you need," he said quietly, "you're free to go." She had not expected that. He could see it in the small collapse of her posture, the slight backward shift, the recalibration happening behind her eyes. She wanted argument. She wanted raised voices and slammed things, so she could leave cleanly with her version of events intact. She wanted him to give her something to push against. He gave her nothing. He walked past her and went upstairs. 3 days later, she packed 2 bags. She moved out on a Thursday afternoon while he was at work. He came home to a house that looked the same in every visible detail, but felt different in the way a room feels when something essential has been removed from it. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then he started making dinner. Brennan told people they were separating. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you report something factual. He told his parents over the phone on a Sunday. He told his co-workers at the garage when they noticed the wedding ring was gone. He used the word separating because it was accurate and because it required no further explanation. Small towns are patient with half-truths, but terrible at keeping secrets. About 6 weeks after Cassidy left, his cousin Wade showed up on a Friday evening with a 6-pack of beer and the expression of a man carrying something he wished he did not have to carry. Wade was 2 years older than Brennan and had grown up on the same street. He was direct and uncomfortable with sentimentality, which was exactly why the look on his face when Brennan opened the door was so legible. They sat on the back steps of the house. The yard was dark except for the light above the back door. A dog was barking somewhere down the block. October had properly settled in, and the air was cold and smelled like wet leaves and the smoke from someone's fireplace up the street. They worked through a couple of beers in silence. Wade turned his bottle slowly in his hands. "There's something you should know," he said. Brennan looked at him. "She's been in the city. A lot." He paused. "Different guys. More than one." The dog down the block went quiet. Brennan felt his stomach tighten in the specific way it does when you receive information that explains too much all at once. It was not exactly surprise. It was more like the sound a lock makes when a key you did not know existed slides into it and turns. All the things he had half noticed and half dismissed over the past year realigned themselves in an instant into a picture that was clear and complete and ugly. "How long?" he asked. Wade exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that carries weight. "Probably months before she left." Brennan set his beer down on the step beside him. The air was cold enough that his breath was faintly visible. He looked at the yard, at the brown grass, at the garden beds along the fence that Cassidy had talked about planting the previous spring and never did. He remembered standing in that exact spot with her in April, the two of them looking at the beds, her talking about what she wanted to grow, him half listening and half planning the irrigation, and the memory had a different shape now. He thought about the locked phone, the late nights, the way she had looked at their living room like she was measuring the distance to the door. He had pushed each of those things aside because he was not the kind of man who accused his wife of things he could not prove, who turned suspicion into confrontation just because something felt wrong. He had given her the benefit of every doubt he had. He had been wrong to doubt his own instincts. but he was not sure he would have done it differently. That was just who he was. The back steps were cold beneath him. "I'm sorry," Wade said. He meant it. Brennan nodded once. A small, deliberate movement. They sat there for another hour. Wade did not ask how he was feeling because he was not that kind of person, and Brennan did not offer it because he was not that kind of person either. They drank and said nothing much, and when Wade stood up and said he should get going, Brennan told him he appreciated it. He meant that too. After Wade left, Brennan stayed on the steps in the dark for a long time. He was not spiraling. He was processing the way he processed everything systematically, looking at the information from different angles and arriving at conclusions that he then stored rather than broadcast. The anger was there underneath, but it was not the violent, crashing kind. It was slow and clean, and he recognized it as something that would not consume him if he did not feed it. The social media photographs came later, and they were worse because of how public they were. Cassidy had left her accounts open. Whether that was carelessness or something else, Brennan chose not to speculate. But people talked, and eventually a link found its way to his phone through a mutual acquaintance who said he had a right to know what was being posted. Brennan looked once. Cassidy in a bar with her hair down, laughing in a group of men he did not recognize. Cassidy at a rooftop party in an outfit that had nothing to do with the life on Maplewood Drive. Cassidy in someone's apartment, close to a man who was watching her with specific attention. The comments underneath were careless and cruel in the way things are when people mistake being an observer for having a stake in something. Some of these people had been at his wedding. Some had eaten dinner at his table. He put the phone down. He did not pick it up again that night. He went to the garage the next morning and did his work and came home and made food, and that was how he moved through it. Not by avoiding the information, but by not allowing it to become the story he told himself about himself. Because the thing about what Cassidy had done was that it said very little about Brennan and a great deal about Cassidy, and he was not willing to carry the weight of someone else's choices as though they were his own failures. He closed that account, the way you close a browser window when you have seen what you needed to see. Brennan filed for divorce at the end of November. He drove to the county clerk's office on a gray Tuesday morning before work, filled out the forms at a table near the window, and handed them to a woman behind the counter who processed them with the same neutral efficiency she applied to everything on her desk. He paid the filing fee, received a stamped copy of the petition, and drove to the garage. He changed into his work clothes in the break room and was under the hood of a Freightliner by 8:45. He had hired a family law attorney named Deborah Marsh, a practical woman in her 50s who had handled hundreds of these and wasted no energy on sentiment. She gave him a flat rate, explained the timeline, and walked him through what to expect. Michigan law required a 60-day waiting period after filing. If the proceeding was uncontested and there were no complex assets, the process would be clean. She would serve the paperwork to Cassidy's last known address. Cassidy did not respond for 3 weeks. His attorney filed a follow-up notification. Still nothing for another 2 weeks. Then Cassidy finally retained her own attorney and reviewed the terms. There was no property dispute. The house was solely in Brennan's name, always had been. They had no children. Their finances had been functionally separated for months already. What there was mostly was waiting. One afternoon, while Brennan was eating lunch alone at the kitchen table, his phone lit up with a message. He looked at the screen. "Cassidy, you're moving on fast." He stared at the message. He thought about what it contained. Not an accusation, exactly. More like a test. She was checking whether there was still something in him she could reach. Whether the door she had shut herself was still open from the inside. He deleted the message. He finished his sandwich. He rinsed the plate and set it in the drying rack and went back to the afternoon. Something had changed in him over the past few months, but it was not the brittle, frozen hardness of someone who has turned their pain into armor. It was something more structural than that. More like the denseness that bone develops after a fracture heals, tougher at the site of the break than anywhere else. Built by the fracture, not destroyed by it. He was not angry at Cassidy. Anger required caring what someone thought of you, and he had stopped requiring anything from her on the night she packed her bags. What he felt was more like a settled clarity, a clean line drawn. The paperwork was almost complete. The procedure was almost finished. He was done. Not in a way that needed an audience. Just done. The way a task is done when you have finished it and set down your tools. Cassidy Hale had told herself a story about freedom, and for the first few weeks after she left, the story seemed to be true. She moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building near downtown Grand Rapids, far enough from Maplewood Drive that she would not cross paths with anyone who knew her life there. The elevator was unreliable, and the walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's music on weeknights, but she had picked everything in the space herself, and that felt like something. Her choices on every surface. Her life arranged by no one but her. She started going out 3-4 nights a week. Her friend Natalie, who had ended her own long relationship the previous year and navigated the transition with the breezy competence of someone who had always expected things to work out, knew people everywhere, and moved through social scenes the way a current moves through water, carrying everything along with it. Through Natalie, Cassidy was introduced to a version of Grand Rapids she had not been part of since before her marriage. Clubs on the river with music so loud you felt it in your sternum. Rooftop gatherings in the late summer where people stood with drinks and said things that seemed meaningful in the moment and disappeared by morning. Dinner tables full of people in their late 20s and early 30s who talked about travel and career moves and weekend plans with the ease of people for whom the calendar was always full. She was good at fitting in. She had always been good at that. It was the thing she and Brennan had never fully discussed, the fact that she could walk into any room and feel at home in it within 10 minutes, while he could walk into a room he had been in 100 times and still seemed to be calculating his position. She had envied him that solidity once, and then, gradually, started to resent it. His comfort with stillness had looked, from the inside of her growing restlessness, like a ceiling. Now she was in the open air she had wanted. Men noticed her almost immediately. She was genuinely attractive, and she carried herself with a restlessness that some men interpreted as possibility. They bought her drinks. They leaned in close over the bar noise to say things she had to ask them to repeat. They asked for her number before midnight. She told herself this was what she had left for. For a while, honestly, it was. But the texture of things shifted in ways she did not have language for until they had already shifted. The men who paid close attention on a first night were often somewhere else by the third. The ones who texted enthusiastically for a week went quiet around the time she started to invest more than surface interest. She noticed that conversations never moved beneath the first layer. No one asked what she did for work with actual curiosity. No one remembered what she had mentioned liking or disliking the week before. The talking was plentiful, but the knowing was absent, and she had not identified that distinction when she was planning her exit from Maplewood Drive. She had imagined that leaving would drop her into a life that looked like the best version of the one she felt she was missing. She had pictured people who challenged her intellectually and spoke about ideas over long meals. She had pictured herself at the center of something alive and forward-moving. What she found instead was a social world that rewarded being present, attractive, and available, and asked nothing deeper than that. The depth she had imagined was available somewhere, presumably for someone. But the path she had taken did not run through it, and she had been on it long enough now to understand that the path and the destination were not separable. A man named Preston, tall and well-dressed and precise in the way men are when they're used to making presentations, took her to dinner twice and then stopped answering his phone. She sent 2 texts before she set the phone down and made herself stop. She told herself he was probably traveling. She knew better than that. Another man she had been seeing for 3 weeks blocked her everywhere without warning or explanation. She discovered it when a call went straight to a generic message with no voicemail. She sat with her phone in her hand in her apartment kitchen for nearly half an hour before she made herself stand up and find something else to do with her hands. The third was the one that stayed with her longest. His name was Derek. He was funny and sure of himself, and the first man since she had left who made her laugh in the way she used to laugh, spontaneously, without effort, the kind of laughter that comes from somewhere real. She had allowed herself to think about him between the times they were together. She had imagined, carefully and quietly, that this might be the beginning of something that actually resembled a life. On a Saturday afternoon, After they had spent most of the day together, she asked if they could go on a proper date. A real dinner, somewhere with a tablecloth, just the two of them, without a group around them. Derek had looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Then he had laughed, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "You're fun, Cassidy," he said, "but I'm not really looking for something serious right now." He had tilted his head slightly. "Honestly, you're not really girlfriend material." She kept her face still. She said something easy and redirected the conversation because she was not going to sit in front of this man and absorb his assessment visibly. But she carried those words out of his apartment and into her car and drove home with them in the passenger seat, and she was still sitting with them 3 days later. Not girlfriend material. She turned the phrase over from different angles the way you press a bruise to understand where exactly it hurts. She was not sure what she had expected from a year. She had expected liberation and self-discovery and all the experiences she had convinced herself were passing her by on Maplewood Drive. She had not expected to arrive, after 8 months of motion, at a sentence like that one. When autumn came, the social world Cassidy had moved through so freely all summer began quietly contracting. The women from her life before, the ones from college and from the neighborhood years, the ones she had known for long enough that their friendship had a history and a texture, had stopped initiating contact. When Cassidy reached out, the responses were brief. When she suggested plans, people were busy that week, maybe next week, and next week never arranged itself into anything. It happened so gradually, this withdrawal, that she could not point to a moment when it started, only to the accumulation of silences that now made up most of her social life. The newer crowd moved differently. People at parties were warm in the room and absent outside of it. She would have a conversation that felt real, exchange numbers with a woman she genuinely liked, and send a text the next afternoon that received a heart reaction and nothing more. The warmth existed only inside the moment. Outside of it, she was just another contact in someone's phone. The crowd around her thinned. Natalie had met someone she was serious about, and her nights out had dropped to maybe once a month. When she did come out, she left early, and the conversations between her and Cassidy had changed in a way neither of them was openly naming. Natalie was building something, and Cassidy was still searching for something, and the gap between those two positions had grown wider than either of them had acknowledged. Cassidy found herself at gatherings where she recognized faces but had no actual history with anyone. She was familiar but not known, present but not rooted. The distinction, which had not mattered when everything was new and the pace was high, mattered more than she had expected now that the pace had slowed. One Friday night in September, she was at a bar near the river, standing at the edge of a group she had arrived with, half inside the conversation and half watching the room the way she had learned to do, when she caught pieces of a conversation happening at the bar beside her. 2 men, maybe 30 years old, one in a dark jacket, one in a gray shirt. She did not know them. They were not aware of her. The man in the dark jacket gestured with his drink in the direction of her side of the room. "That's the girl who walked out on her husband," he said. The bar was loud enough that she had to concentrate to catch it. The man in the gray shirt looked over. He found her with his eyes and looked back at his friend. "Yeah," he said. "She'll go home with anyone." They moved on. Cassidy stood very still. It was not a loud moment. It was not a confrontation. Neither man had said it to her face. But the sound of it reached all the way inside her and found something it could attach to. And what it attached to was the growing suspicion she had been outrunning for weeks. She had not thought of herself in those terms. She had thought of herself as someone living freely, someone who had made a brave choice, someone who was figuring herself out. She had a version of her own story that was reasonable and personal and fully justified. But she was not in her own story tonight. She was in someone else's sentence. A background character defined by one piece of information and what that piece of information implied. She had built that reputation herself. She had not known she was building it at the time. She had been too busy moving to notice what she was leaving behind her. She set her glass down. She said something quiet to the group about needing air. She walked out of the bar and onto the street, where the fall air was cold and direct, and the noise from inside fell away behind her. She stood on the sidewalk and did not move for a while. and she took out her phone and ordered a ride home. In the back seat of the car, she did not look at her phone. She watched the city through the window, the lit storefronts and the people on the sidewalks, and the ordinary movement of a Friday night in a city that did not know her name, and she said nothing the whole way home. 8 months after she walked out the door on Maplewood Drive, Cassidy sat alone in her apartment on a Sunday evening with nothing ahead of her. She had kept herself in motion for so long that stillness had become a foreign sensation, something the body resisted before it was forced to accept it. The weekend had dissolved without delivering anything. A plan with 2 people had not materialized. The afternoon had come and gone in a series of small domestic tasks. She stretched out longer than necessary because they gave the hours a shape. Now it was Sunday evening, and the apartment was quiet, and her phone had gone still after 1 in the afternoon, and the silence had a quality she had not had to sit with before. She opened her bank account and looked at the numbers for a long moment. 8 months of Ubers and bar tabs, and new clothes for nights that blurred together when she tried to remember them individually. She had left a stable job in marketing to take something in the city that paid less, but it felt exciting in the interview. The excitement had not survived contact with the actual work, and the pay cut had remained. She thought about calling someone and went through her contacts slowly and could not find anyone who would answer a call on a Sunday evening with the kind of presence she actually needed. The real friends, the ones who had that quality, were the ones she had let go quiet over the past year. They had their own lives now, children in some cases, mortgages, partners. She had drifted while they were building things, and the drift had been so pleasant in the beginning that she had not noticed the distance it created. She had not noticed because she had been surrounded by people the entire time. That was the specific cruelty of the kind of loneliness she was sitting with. It did not arrive in isolation. It arrived in the middle of a crowd, dressed as connection, holding a drink in its hand. She had been surrounded by people for 8 months, and she was more alone in this apartment than she had been in any single evening on Maplewood Drive. She got up and walked to the window. The street below was ordinary. A couple walked a dog along the sidewalk. A car parallel parked with effort across the street. The yellow light of the pizza place on the corner threw a warm rectangle across the pavement. She thought about Brennan. She had not allowed herself to do this in months, had kept it behind a door she walked past quickly whenever she felt herself slowing down near it. Staying in motion had been the strategy. Motion and noise and new things had served as a sufficient substitute for honest thought. But tonight the motion had stopped and the noise was absent, and the door was open, and she walked through it before she could redirect herself. She thought about the coffee. He made it every morning without announcement, the same automatic machine, the same ground in the dark blue bag from the grocery store. He always made enough for 2, even on mornings when she slept in, even during the months when she was already pulling away from him in ways she had not yet articulated. She would come downstairs late and find a full pot waiting. She had never once told him that she noticed. She had accepted it as furniture, as a background feature of a life she was looking around rather than at. She thought about Saturday mornings. Him on the back steps with a cup of coffee and a project to think through. He did not need to be anywhere. He did not need noise or company or external stimulation to feel like himself. He was comfortable in his own company in a way she had always privately respected and occasionally resented, because it made her own restlessness feel less like ambition and more like a symptom. She thought about the night she stood in the kitchen and told him she needed to go. She had rehearsed it. She had convinced herself it was courage. He had looked at her and offered her the door without a single word of protest, and she had walked out thinking that proved he did not love her enough to fight for her. She had actually thought that. She had taken the most dignified thing he had ever done and turned it into evidence against him. The tears came without warning. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She had destroyed something real, something that had been patient and consistent and completely reliable in a world that had spent 8 months demonstrating to her in various ways just how rare those qualities were. She had looked at patience and called it stagnation. She had looked at consistency and called it boredom. She had looked at a man who loved her without theater and decided the lack of theater meant something was missing. Something was missing. She understood that now. It was her. She sat down on the couch and let herself feel the full weight of it. The apartment around her was neat and quiet and entirely her own, and it was completely insufficient. Not because of its size or its furnishings, but because of what it represented. A life she had constructed from scratch that had turned out, on close inspection, to be nothing more than a series of evenings that felt like something and then evaporated. She had not been okay for a long time. She had been moving fast enough to avoid knowing that. Now she was still. The drive back to Maplewood Drive took 18 minutes. Cassidy had made that drive hundreds of times over the years, enough that her hands knew the turns the way hands know the shape of something they have held often. But this time she gripped the wheel with both hands and kept her eyes on the road with the deliberate attention of someone who is afraid that if they lose focus for a moment, they will turn the car around. She had sat with the decision for 4 days after that Sunday evening before she got in the car. She had wanted to think it through properly, not act on feeling alone. Wednesday came, and she drove to the edge of the highway and then changed her mind and went home. She waited until the following Tuesday and told herself that the waiting was rational and not fear, even though she knew it was mostly fear. Fear of what? Specifically, she had not fully allowed herself to name until she was parked across the street looking at the house. She was afraid he had moved on. She was afraid that even if he had not, the damage was too complete to repair regardless. She was afraid of standing in his living room and saying everything she had come to say and watching his face stay still and closed while she said it. She was afraid of the particular quality of silence that follows the word no when it comes from someone who has thought carefully before speaking and means it without reservation. She was also afraid, underneath all of that, of what it said about her that this was where she had ended up. She had stood in the kitchen 8 months ago and told a good man that she needed to experience life. And now she was back at his front door. The arithmetic of that was not kind. And she had spent the previous 4 days trying to find a version of it that was something other than what it clearly was. She parked across the street and cut the engine. The house on Maplewood Drive looked exactly the same. The same vinyl siding, slightly faded at the south-facing corner where the sun hit longest. The same porch with the 2 wooden steps she had painted white herself 6 years ago. The same light fixture above the door with the small crack in the glass cover that Brennan had mentioned needing to replace and then not gotten around to. The yard was raked clean. The flower beds along the front were cleared for winter, mulched down with a neatness she recognized as Brennan's. He had done that recently. She could tell from the fresh, dark line of the mulch against the soil. She sat in the car for 10 minutes. Then she got out. Her hands were not steady as she crossed the street. Everything she had rehearsed over the past 4 days felt like a screenplay for a version of herself she was not sure she could perform at this particular moment. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the door. She climbed the steps. She knocked. She heard footsteps inside almost immediately. Not rushed. Steady. The sound of someone moving through their own house without urgency. The door opened. Brennan Hale stood in the frame. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt and jeans and work boots, and he held the door with one hand and looked at her with an expression that she had always thought of as his listening face. Patient. Still. Taking everything in before responding to any of it. His eyes moved over her quickly and settled on her face and stayed there. Something about him was different, though she needed a moment to find the word for it. He was calmer than she remembered, more present somehow, like a man who had found his footing and planted himself on it. Cassidy, he said, just her name. No warmth in it. No edge, just the straightforward recognition of the person standing on his porch. She had told herself she would stay composed, that she would be clear and measured and say what she came to say without losing control of the conversation. Her voice cracked on the first word. I made a mistake. He looked at her without responding. The cold air moved between them. Down the street, a car turned the corner and went past. She swallowed. Can I come inside? He looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open. She walked into the house. The inside was different from her memory of it in ways that were difficult to name specifically. The furniture had been rearranged. The couch sat at a different angle. There was a new rug in the hallway. The shelf above the fireplace, where photographs had been arranged for the better part of their marriage, was empty except for a small potted plant and a stack of paperback books. The space felt clean and occupied and completely his. She stood in the living room with her arms crossed over her chest. Brennan stood in the doorway to the kitchen. He did not sit. He did not offer her a seat. He stood there looking at her with that expression that gave her nothing to work with. "I'm listening," he said. Everything she had prepared fell apart the moment she opened her mouth. The composed, rational version of herself, the one who was going to present a clear and measured case, disappeared at the first word, and what came out instead was the accumulated weight of 8 months arriving all at once. "I convinced myself I was missing something," she said. Her voice was not steady, and she made no further attempt to make it steady. "I looked at this house and this life, and I told myself it was too small, that I was going to run out of time to figure out who I was if I didn't leave." Brennan stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and his face still. "I was wrong." She paused. The word was too short. It didn't contain nearly enough. Not just about leaving, about everything I thought was going to be waiting for me on the other side of it. She told him about the city. She did not minimize it or frame it carefully. She described the bar nights that had all started to look identical after a while. The men who treated her like something temporary. The moment she stood on a sidewalk in September and heard her own name used in a sentence that was technically about someone else. She told him about Derek and what he had said to her, and she repeated the exact words because she felt that vagueness would be dishonest. "He told me I wasn't girlfriend material." She watched Brennan's face. Nothing moved in it. "I spent weeks trying to diagnose that, trying to identify the specific thing I had done wrong that caused someone to see me that way. But the longer I examined it, the more I understood it wasn't a calculation problem. It was just the truth of who I had become." Brennan listened. He stood in the kitchen doorway and let her talk without interrupting, without filling silences, without signaling what he thought. She knew this quality of his. She had found it reassuring early in their relationship and infuriating later. And now, standing in his living room with nowhere to hide, she found it honest. He was not performing anything. He was just taking in what she was saying and deciding what to do with it. She was crying now, which she had not intended, but the intention was no longer particularly relevant. "The men I met out there don't respect me." The word came out unsteady. "I know exactly how I got to that point. I'm not standing here pretending to be a victim of anything except my own choices." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But I need you to know that I see it now. All of it. Everything I had and everything I treated like it was temporary." She took a breath. "I had the best thing I have ever had in my life," she said quietly, "and I walked out on it because it didn't look the way I thought a big life was supposed to look." The last sentence cost her something. Brennan had not moved from the kitchen doorway. His arms were at his sides. His face was still and open, the face of someone listening completely without giving any indication of what they were going to do with what they heard. She looked at him directly. "I want to try again," she said. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was just complete. The kind of silence that fills a room when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and the person who received it is deciding how to be honest. Brennan turned and walked into the kitchen. She heard the sound of a drawer opening, paper moving. She stood in the living room with her hands at her sides, her breathing shallow, waiting. He came back. He was carrying a document, folded once along its center. He held it out to her, and she took it. She opened it. It took her a moment to process what she was looking at. Then she saw the letterhead, the county seal, the names, the date, the signature line at the bottom with both their names and the certification stamp from the court. The final divorce order. Signed, filed, complete. She stared at the paper. She had known this was coming. She had been part of the process. She had signed her own set of papers weeks ago. But holding the finalized document in her hands in this room, with Brennan standing 4 feet away from her, made it real in a way the abstract knowledge of it had not. "It's done," he said. The words were quiet, conversational almost, but they arrived with a weight that pressed the air out of her chest. She looked at the page for a long time. Her shoulders collapsed. "You didn't even fight for us," she said. She heard how it sounded the moment the words left her. She knew they were wrong, But they were out now, and she could not pull them back. Brennan looked at her. "I did," he said. He let that settle for exactly 1 second. For 4 years. 3 words. Not said with heat. Not said to wound. Said the way you state a measurement. The way you read a number from a gauge. Simple and factual and entirely without adornment. She understood what he meant. She understood it with a clarity that arrived all at once and sat in her chest like a stone. He had been fighting for their marriage for years. Not with arguments or ultimatums, but with every morning cup of coffee left for her without being asked. With the roof he fixed over 2 weekends. With the dinner reservation she had canceled and the trip she had said maybe to, and the dozens of small, consistent choices of a man who was showing up repeatedly, without requiring the showing up to be noticed or praised or rewarded. He had fought quietly. He had fought for 4 years without receiving acknowledgement for it from the one person whose acknowledgement mattered. And she had looked at that fight, that patient, invisible fight, and decided it wasn't enough. The paper in her hands was just paper, but it was the most permanent thing she had touched in 8 months. Cassidy stood in the living room of the house on Maplewood Drive and wept. Not the careful, private crying she had allowed herself in her apartment. This came from deeper than that, from the part of herself that she had been running fast enough to outpace for the better part of a year. It arrived without warning and without the small dignities of composure. Her shoulders shook. She pressed one hand over her mouth. The divorce document was still in her other hand, and she held it because she did not know where to set it. Brennan stood across the room from her. He did not move toward her. He did not speak. He waited with a steadiness that was neither cruel nor cold. He was simply present, the way he had always been present, without requiring the moment to be something other than what it was. She pulled herself together slowly. The kind of pulling together that happens when you have no other option, when you cannot stay collapsed, because you're the only person in the situation who can move you. "I ruined everything," she said. "Yes," Brennan said. One syllable, stated without pleasure and without apology. A fact offered back to her, because she had stated it correctly, and he saw no reason to soften an accurate observation. She wiped her face. The finality of the word landed harder than any sentence she had ever received. There was no cruelty in it. He was not enjoying her distress, but he was not going to comfort her with dishonesty either. She had earned the truth, and the truth was yes. She folded the divorce document slowly, her fingers working the paper without her being fully aware of it. "Please." Her voice cracked on the word. She made herself say the next part. "I can change." He shook his head, a small, deliberate movement. Final in the way things are when they come from certainty rather than stubbornness. "Brennan." She said his name the way you say something you're trying to hold in your hands. "After everything we built, after all those years, you're closing this door completely." "The door was closed before you came here," he said. "You're only standing in front of it today." She opened her mouth. Nothing came. The afternoon had grown darker outside the windows. The light in the room was gray and low, and the street beyond the glass was the quiet of early evening when the day has finished and the night has not yet started. She made one more attempt because she could not leave without making it. "I know I don't have any right to ask," she said. "I know exactly what I walked away from, and I know exactly what I spent 8 months doing instead. I'm not asking you to forget any of that. I'm asking you to think about whether there is still something here worth trying for." Brennan was quiet. She watched his face with everything she had, looking for any door left open, any hesitation, any crack of light underneath. He had known, standing in that kitchen doorway, listening to her, that she was not lying. She had not come here with a performance. She had come with the truth, whatever good the truth was now, and he could hear it in her voice and see it in her face. She had been humbled by the year she had put herself through, and she meant every word she had said to him. But meaning it did not change what was real. You could not go back and unsign documents. You could not return to a house you had freely chosen to leave and find it preserved exactly as you remembered, waiting. Life did not work that way, and Brennan had never been a man who pretended that it did. The divorce was filed and finalized, and it was the correct outcome of the choices they had both made, her to leave and him to let her. Those choices had consequences. He respected consequences. He was not someone who bent the shape of reality to make difficult feelings easier. He felt something for her in that moment. He would not have been honest with himself if he denied it. You did not spend 4 years building a life with someone and feel nothing when you watch them stand in your living room and weep. But feelings were not architecture. They were weather. They passed through and left you, and the structure either held or it didn't, and his structure had been built on solid enough ground that it was holding. He was going to be all right. He had been all right before he met her, and he had been all right throughout the years of the marriage, and he had been all right through the months of the separation, and he was all right now. Then he spoke. "I hope you figure your life out, Cassidy." There was genuine feeling in those words. Not warmth exactly, but something real. The feeling of a person who once cared very much about someone, who still wishes them something good, but who has arrived on the other side of caring what happens to himself in relation to that someone. He meant it. He hoped she found what she was looking for. He was capable of meaning it completely and honestly, because it lived in a separate place from the decision about his own life, which had already been made and filed and stamped. She placed the divorce document on the small table beside the couch. She did not fully understand why she set it there. It belonged to the courthouse, but she could not carry it out the door. She moved toward the front door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She looked back at him one last time. One final, honest look at the man she had known since she was 23 years old. The man who fixed things and made coffee and loved without theater. The man who had stood in this room through 4 years of her pulling away and had not once made her feel guilty for it. She had called that kind of love ordinary once. Standing here now, she understood that ordinary was the wrong word entirely. Ordinary was everywhere. What Brennan had offered her was rare, and she had needed 8 months of its absence to learn the difference. He met her eyes. He held them. She nodded. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a clean, soft click. The sound of a latch returning home. Not a statement. Not a punctuation. Just the door doing what it was designed to do. Brennan stood in his living room for a moment. He listened to her footsteps on the porch steps, on the walkway, then fading, then gone. He picked the document up from the table and carried it to the kitchen and returned it to the drawer where it belonged. Then he washed his hands at the sink the way he always washed his hands, working the soap in carefully, rinsing until the water ran clear. Outside the window, above the sink, the sky had gone from gray to the deep, quiet blue of early evening at the edges where the light had drained first. The street below was ordinary and still. A neighbor walked past with a bag of groceries. A porch light came on down the block. He was aware of something moving through him that did not have a simple name. Not relief and not victory and not grief. Something between all of those, the specific sensation of setting down a weight that you have carried so long it became part of your posture. And then your posture changes, and you feel at once lighter and unfamiliar with yourself. And then the unfamiliarity passes, and what remains is just the person you actually are without the weight. He thought about who he had been at 25, standing in an altar in a rented hall with a sticky floor, genuinely certain about the future. He did not regret that person. That person had been right to believe in what he believed in. He had not been wrong to love her, or to build what he built with her, or to hold on as long as he held on. He had done everything he knew how to do. He had shown up repeatedly and honestly and without theater. If that was not enough for a particular person, then the answer was not to become a different person. The answer was to find out who he was on the other side of it. He was finding out. He reached for the coffee machine. He made a single cup. He stood at the kitchen window and drank it while the neighborhood outside went about its quiet evening life. And the feeling that settled into him slowly, without announcement, was something that felt very much like solid ground. He did not perform the ending of the evening for anyone. He did not stand there being strong or being resolute or being anything in particular. He was just a man in his kitchen on a Tuesday evening drinking a cup of coffee he had made himself, watching the light drain out of the sky over Maplewood Drive. The furnace kicked on quietly. The house was warm. His tools were in the garage, and his truck was in the driveway. And the work week was not finished, but tomorrow was Wednesday, and it would proceed the way Wednesdays proceeded, with problems that needed solving and a set of capable hands to solve them. He was 30 years old, and his marriage was over, and the person he had loved for 4 years had come to his door, and he had looked at her clearly and chosen himself. That was not a small thing. He thought, briefly and without malice, that she would be all right eventually. People were. They went through things, and they came out the other side changed. And the change was sometimes better than what they had been before, and sometimes not. And in either case, it was their own. He had no further stake in which way it went for her. He rinsed his cup in the sink. He turned off the kitchen light. He walked through the quiet house, checking the lock on the front door out of habit, pausing for a moment in the living room where the small lamp was still on and the plant on the shelf was doing fine and the books were where he had left them. His house, his things, his life continuing. He turned off the lamp. He went upstairs. Outside, Cassidy sat on the top porch step in the cold. She had not intended to sit, but her legs had simply decided they were not ready to carry her to the car yet. She sat there with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the street she had pulled in and out of for years without registering what it meant to have a street to come home to. The crack in the porch railing was still there. She had mentioned it to Brennan at some point. He had said he would get to it. In the way of small household repairs, it had remained unaddressed for 2 years. She had found this annoying once. She found it something else now. A leaf fell from the oak tree at the edge of the yard and spiraled down onto the step beside her. She watched it settle. She thought about the drive home, the apartment waiting for her, the quiet third floor with the thin walls and the refrigerator hum. She had chosen all of it. She had chosen it loudly and deliberately and with full confidence, and she was going to go back to it tonight and lie awake in it, and that was the consequence of choices made with open eyes. The couple from down the block walked their dog past the end of the driveway. They did not look up. The dog pulled toward a pile of leaves, and the man pulled gently back, and they continued on, entirely absorbed in their own ordinary Tuesday evening. The world had not stopped for what happened inside that house. It had not taken note. Nothing outside this porch knew or cared that a marriage had ended here or that a woman was sitting on cold wooden steps understanding, 8 months too late, what she had done. Cassidy understood, sitting there as the evening deepened around her, that freedom without responsibility is not freedom at all. It is just velocity. It looks like living from the inside. It feels like something real. But when it stops, what remains is not the life you were building. It is just the distance you have traveled, and if you traveled in the wrong direction, the distance is the measure of what you lost. She stood up. She walked down the porch steps. She crossed the street and got in her car and drove away, and Maplewood Drive returned to its quiet Tuesday evening as if she had never been there at all. Behind her, the porch light above the door burned steadily in the growing dark. It lit the empty porch and the clean front steps and the winter-mulched flower beds and the ordinary, unremarkable face of a house where a man was getting on with his life. Nobody was coming. Brennan Hale slept soundly that night. In the morning, he woke without alarm, the way he always did. He made 1 cup of coffee. He stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and watched the November morning arrive over the street, gray and still and entirely his own. Then the day began.